So the first speaker is going to be Nicholas Green, and he's going to be talking about from API to beautiful Ajax. He's from Typeform, so yeah.
Let me take off my jacket because it's a warm day in San Francisco, so we should all enjoy a warm day in San Francisco. As we don't know when it's going to be the next one. All right, cool. So very excited to be here. Very excited to be at the first event organized by APIMatic in San Francisco. I think I met them on the first trip they made here about 5 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. And they came for one of the API conferences and they told me about their projects. I'm really glad to see the progress they made. Really happy to see you guys on over here and on the internet, as apparently we were live stream. So I'm Nicholas. This is my username on most of the social network, including the Microsoft coding network they just acquired called GitHub. So please come find some of the projects that I've made there and continue the conversation online. Feel free to get some tweets. And as we mentioned in the introduction, I work for a company called Typeform. How many of you have heard about Typeform? Ooh, nice. Thank you. I see a lot of hands raising up if you don't see the visual online. I'm still new at Typeform. So it's been 4 months now that I've been boarded in our Barcelona office. So I would like to ask you to bear with me with the story I'm going to tell, because part of the story happened before I joined, but I'm really happy I can enjoy the consequences of that story. Just to tell you a bit about ourselves, we're based in Barcelona, but we just opened an office in San Francisco about a few months ago. And we have other team members in the room. David over here. So that's a third of the San Francisco team. We have about 200 employees now and used by many companies around the world, mainly marketers, but you can do a lot of different things with Typeform. Basically, we turn this kind of awful experience you have when you're filling a form online that really don't engage you to write anything on this form and don't engage you to write any feedback when they ask for it, to something a bit more fun and enjoyable when it's one question at a time. You give direct feedback to the user, you can put some logics, and it's more like a conversation. So we have the tools that let you ask you a question like, hey, what's your name? I'm Nicholas. And then question number 2 is, hey, Nicholas, how old are you? And so it feels a bit more natural. If you would have to do that on your own coding, that's doable, but that would be a lot of pain. So this is what we do, but enough about what we do, and let's try to get deep dive into the technical stuff, because that's where we're all here for, right? Show me some code. So basically the story is about how we turn our monolith that we had into some microservices, and how that helped us through our API journey, and how we became suddenly an API company, although our main users are not developers. So it all started in 2011 when the founders of this startup, there were 2 designers, and they created something that was cool at that time, was a PHP app. And I guess that was the technology you were using in 2011, and you still have people that use it today, but the paradigm has changed. So at that time, making a PHP app with a MySQL database was pretty standard. And so everything worked well, but with that roots, with that foundation, came some problems. The main one was around the difficulty to make some changes. So when we were iterating the product, when we were iterating with user requests, people wanted more features. But as we had built the UI and the logic very coupled, it was pretty hard to add new features. Same thing happened with the choice we made in database. At that time, we only had one database to store everything. So whenever we were running some migration, that will be a pain, and we will be afraid of making some, like adding new features, because when we run a migration, eventually we break the whole thing. And I think I remember there were some times where the product was done because, well, we made some mistakes. So the other thing that also happened, as you have a monolith app, usually when you do scaling, you don't have any option of scaling parts of it, you just scale everything. That results in a lot of costing issues if we had to face a lot of user requests and a lot of people using the tool, and we were not as reactive as we should have been and as we could be today. So we're just like spinning instances constantly when we may not have needed. So that's where we come from, and that's the different issues we had. The idea was to move, and I think that comes about like a year, 2 years ago, when Jason Harmon joined on the team. I don't know if you're familiar with the API space, but he was pretty involved around the open API spec, and I was full Swagger before. So he's part of the API family, and he came on board and looked at how we can APIs a bit our internal infrastructure, and that's how we moved from this monolith to a more microservice infrastructure. The whole idea was to break down how we work inside and how the different system we have inside into different microservices. So if we look at the Typeform product and how it works, you have different parts of the product. You have the part that's around the builder, where you build some forms. You have some part around the response, when people are filling the forms. And you have some parts around everything that is going to be around the managing images, managing themes. And so ideally, we turn that each individual part of the product into a different microservice, and we did the same with the database. So now each part of the product has its own database. So when we need to ship something for results, it won't affect the performances of the other services. Yes. In the same time, when we were doing this, we also took the opportunity to build some proxy for having a standard authentication system on top of the microservices. And we will use this for our UI to call the APIs directly. So now the UI will be more dependent on the API, and we'll have like an API first driven product. When we build those microservices, we try to aim for the future, so we won't be hold whenever we need to grow. And so the language of the future right now, we'll see how it is in the future. PHP was the language of the future at that time, but we'll see. At the moment, we've done microservices into Golang, and some of the microservices are also in Node, and we'll get into details about what are those microservices. The good thing and the freedom that it brings to us was the possibility to scale each service independently, which is pretty standard in this type of infrastructure. But a good example is around results, the result certs, because we create forms, but we have no way when someone creates a form to imagine how many results or how many responses it could get. So we have to grow with this. So today we create a form, you have 5 responses, and maybe tomorrow this form is shared on a newsletter that has 1,000. We will have to scale this. We'll have to be able to get all the 1,000 responses you may receive. And so the scaling on the result part of the product is not the same scaling on the form creation of the product. And so we, if I'm not mistaken, I think we're not using the same type of databases for the 2 parts, because one it's just consulting, read-only. We don't need to change anything in the response. One is more manipulation. So the results, they're like timestamp, and that's all they need to do. We just retrieve the payload. Everything that's around the product is more something that will get changed and retrieve and manipulate. And as we said earlier, if we separate the databases, that reduce the risks of breaking things. It always could happen, but it's always better to reduce the risk. So the implication into this comes also into our product. I don't know if you have used Typeform, I would say 6 months ago. Yeah, before February. You may have seen a change if you use it also recently. We have shipped a V2, a new version of the interface, and this V2 shouldn't be possible if we haven't made the previous work of decoupling everything and making it into microservices. So now our interface is, again, a lot of cool technologies that are used in 2018, like React, and is making a bunch of API calls directly to our service. So we redone the part of the builder, we redone the results interface when we receive the responses that were sent to your form, and we're now releasing the new version of the renders. This is the experience you see when you're rendering the form. Making this React components gives us more flexibility. In the past, when we wanted to build a new block on the form, so a block is like a question you can ask. So imagine you wanted to get people to, like, we're a DocuSign, so to get someone to sign with DocuSign, if we wanted to build that 6 months ago, we'll have to do a lot of, it will take a lot of time because we will have to support many versions of the infrastructure we had at that time. Now we have components, we have one renderer, and we have APIs, and that should help us make it easier. Yes. So that looks perfect, but still we had some issues, and it could always go wrong. So what we've really learned, one of the things we've learned. So we say that our API is powered by, our interface is powered by APIs, but we then have the issue that our interface is making too many API calls, which cause latency on the user side, which cause poor performances, and that makes the UI code very spaghetti code, where there's a bunch of logic and we have to wait for the response of all the different parts and all the API calls. So this is not the ideal experience. So to counterbalance this issue, we came up with something that we call inside the BEFF, backend for frontend. And it's basically a microservice that's managed by the UX team to respond exactly what they need, to respond to the need they have for displaying a view. So it sits between our UI and the different microservices I mentioned earlier. And what it does is calling the backend and consolidating all the APIs into one call. So on the UI side, you only make one call, and this BFF will be in charge of calling all the other microservices. So we reduce the payload that we send to the UI. We make it less complex, and we only send the data we're interested. And we make it very fast because the connection between the BFF and the services are happening on the same network. So the only thing that costs in latency is from the UI to the BFF. If we illustrate this with a view, so this is like my workspace in Typeform. I see many things, but let's see how it should be done, or how it was done before when we did our first iteration on APIs. Basically, in this view, there are like 4 API calls. One on the left that's calling all the workspace. One on the top that gives us the specific information about the workspace, like who are my collaborators. Another call to get the forms into the workspace. And then another call to get, for each form, the number of responses. So that's, I said 4 API calls, but it's actually 3 API calls plus the number of, plus a call for each form. So that could be really time consuming. So now instead we have one API call that will be responsible to make calls to those microservices, aggregate all the responses, and give us the aggregate payload to the view. And that's what we have here, where we find all the information about the workspace and what we need to render. We don't overcharge with values that are not interesting for the view, so that way we also save on bandwidth. So we went from potentially exponential number of API calls, if we have many forms, to just one API call. The good thing about this, and the work we've done around this, was also that prepared us to be more an API company than we ever been. We used to have a project called Typeform.io that was really decoupled as well from the main product because of the technical issues we had before. So you will create a form on this platform, and you won't see any effect on your Typeform.com thing. So they were like 2 different separate products, and they were almost diverging. They were diverging. So thanks to the work we did on microservices, we're able to make those APIs public to be used by third-party developers. So to do this, we encourage a workflow that really helped our team have a better foundation using the OpenAPI spec. Are you familiar with the OpenAPI? Awesome. It's not called Swagger anymore. It's perfect. No one mentioned that. So the idea is like we start with the spec as the base, and we have a discussion. The engineers have a discussion on the spec before doing any implementation. We try to follow the best practices. We try to follow what people recommend in the industry. And the OpenAPI spec is really the base of our discussions. We add some custom stuff for us to keep track of how the teams are split up the work. So we know who is in charge in the team and which part of the product are involved, as well as is the API is something that we push externally? Is it for partners only, or is it just internal API? And how we are in the status of the development. Is it a beta version of the API, or is it more robust, ready production API? Thanks to this spec and thanks to this single source of truth, we were able to do many other actions. First, we use it for our internal documentation, which is pretty standard to do nowadays with the OpenAPI spec. We also use it for our public documentation. And between those two, we have a system where we can add some custom doc to make the doc a bit more interesting than just here's the spec. This spec also enables the deployment of the API proxy. So everything that's going to be around the external APIs, the configuration and the setup of those external APIs come from the spec, as well as the authentication system. So when we set up a spec that needs specific OAuth scopes, this is, or when we set up an API that needs specific OAuth scopes, that is set up in the spec. So today it's pretty easy to say we need more granular scope in the OAuth dance. We just change some stuff in the spec, and then we can release the changes through the OpenAPI spec. So that gives flexibility, and that gives also a bit of automation on the process of how we do things. If we look at the result, so this is our internal doc. So this is really not something developers will like to play with, but there's still some documentation around this. We use redoc for this. So you give a spec, and that generates a pretty standard view of it. And this is the base also of our discussion, and that's the base of what we see as public, what we see as not public. And this is the result of the same request, the same endpoint, but on the public-facing API. And this is generated by Gatsby, which is a static website generator for React. And then here you see that it's a bit more developer-friendly. Just to give you an example of the public-facing stuff we do with our OpenAPI spec. So when we build those microservices, we also try to think that those microservices eventually, those API endpoints eventually will be public. So we try to avoid putting any not technical, but like every nickname or every product name that we can use internally, because developers that will use this externally can't refer to it. They don't know what it would be about. So everything that's put in the API has to be customer facing eventually. So we use their same language. There are some internal APIs, but they shouldn't be in the near future. And then there's something that's also very interesting in the way that it's built is the unified OAuth system. So we all use API keys. So the UI is using API keys. The partners and the individual developers are using API keys. And then underneath this, all the microservices are dealing with joint token. I'm still trying to figure out exactly how everything works. So I'm not going to go too deep into details, but it's a really interesting subject. And so I'm sure our CPO, Chief Platform Officer, Jason, will have more details. And I think we should write a blog post about this pretty soon. And so eventually what we've done all this for, so it was to help make us more flexible with our product, but also to become this API company and have some APIs for people to use. So now, thanks to those microservices, thanks to the work we've done internally, we have now 3 sets of APIs. The Create API that lets you create forms and create workspaces and like do a bunch of things around the building experience. And then the Response API that's more on what happens when the forms are submitted and what you do with the responses. Some stuff about webhooks and some stuff around the embedding experience. And so all this is powered through this transformation and through the Open API. Right, I think that's all for me. I hope you learned something. And I encourage you to rate this talk. At the end, there's a link. You can see it later. Like this, you can experience the Typeform experience. And I also maybe get some good ratings, and I can tell my boss we should do more of those. Thanks. You have a question?
Yeah. You talked about BFF and Typeform. At some point, did you consider using GraphQL and what was the decision-making process when you figured out how you want to implement that?
Okay, so the question to be repeated on the stream was for the BFF and this intermediary microservice, how we consider using GraphQL. So this thing happened before me, before I joined, and so far I don't think that's anything we had in mind. I'm sure there was some discussion because we're doing React, and so React and GraphQL they should go together. The main reason why I think we didn't do it was for this public-facing API that will eventually happen, and there are not so many public-facing APIs around GraphQL yet, and so if we wanted to work for adoption of APIs, maybe it would have been better to not do GraphQL at the beginning. But for sure, that could solve some of the aggregation and some of the stuff we're doing with those BFF.
What gateway do you guys use?
Good question.
I'm guessing it's like AWS. You guys on AWS too?
I'm not sure. The question was about the API gateway we use. I don't know. I don't think we use the API gateway. Sorry, man.
I'm curious about that too, and also how you get your Open API spec to configure your API gateway. I like the idea.
That's why I asked.
Yes.
Yeah, AWS gateway is pretty easy.
That one does it.
You do it through the API or you do it through the import, but if it's like Kong's a little different. You can,
So no, Kong doesn't ring a bell in our stack. I don't think we use the API gateway either. So I wonder if we haven't built something else. That might be the third alternative option.
I'll ask Jason.
Oh yeah, we should follow up on him on this.
You guys done any custom CRM systems? Contact relationship management?
Regarding which part of the?
I didn't know whether that was something that because that's what you're optimized for.
At the API level, we don't do anything with the CRMs, but that's something we do through our product.
But like as a third-party company, I could set things up and then use your API to handle my backend for.
So as a third party, you can use our APIs to, if you have a CRM, to send when someone fills information about users, like, hey, what's your name, what's your last name, blah, blah. You can push that to your CRM, making some connections through the webhooks. That's something that's totally doable. People are doing this today through connectors like Zapier. And if you want to have more control over this, you can just code it.
Times they're currently using that type of service?
Yes, many.
That way?
Yeah. Many people doing this. We have native integration with, it's not technically a CRM, but that's already part of the flow with MailChimp.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to, when someone submits a form, you can pass the information to MailChimp directly, and then you can send them emails. And I think that's what the APIMatic team used for this event. And HubSpot recently, yes, which also is CRM. Does it answer your question?
I think so. I mean, it basically, so like the utilization is me as a customer. If I wanted to do my own CRM system based on with your software, then I can basically do I have to develop like from the front end perspective, do I just develop a basic form and then have that form be managed by you? Or how does that?
So the forms will always be managed by us. They will always be hosted by us.
Mm-hmm.
You can display the form wherever you want, or you can redirect people to this form. And then the data, you decide where they get put after. We don't have any logic of like following a customer along many forms or anything like this. But if you want to have this stored in a database where you have all the information about the user, and you see how many forms they filled and stuff, you can add this logic later on.
And do you create the forms? Like, am I creating the forms outside of me, or do I go to you guys to create the forms that work with your?
Yes, so you create the forms. The forms, we have a drag and drop interface where you decide you want to ask a simple text question, you want to ask a long text question, you want to say yes, no question. Like you have the different questions you want to ask, and you drag and drop this until it makes a form, and you're happy about this form, and then you share it with whoever you want to fill.
And how would that be different from like a LinkedIn profile or a Facebook profile? Your system versus the form feedback versus something like that.
So the form is like so today when you RSVP for this event, you fill the form with your information. There was just the questions were not related to any of your profiles. They were just questions, and you fill the information into this. But tomorrow, if you want to use this form for a wedding, and you ask for dietary options for the lunch, you could use that as well. So like the flexibility of the builder lets you build many forms, and it is not related to any other social profile.
Because I'm working on several different projects, and one of them is
cool.
One of them is CRM system. The other one is I'm trying to do an MMO, a multiplayer online game.
Yeah, we should talk about this later.
Yeah.
Awesome. Cool.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Cool.
We have Aaron here, who's here for just a little bit. So Aaron here is with DocuSign. Thank you so much to them for providing us this beautiful event. Amazing views. One, I was excited to come listen to these speakers, and secondly, look at this view while I'm listening to them. So thank you so much. Aaron would like to discuss, the kind of things they're up to at DocuSign and the kind of initiatives they're working on in the API space specifically. So I'd like to pass the floor on to Aaron. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So the first rule of developer evangelism that I learned is don't spend 30 minutes talking about something that you can explain in 2 minutes. So I'm going to give myself 2 minutes, then I want you guys to get back to doing whatever it is you guys were doing before, which is eating and enjoying each other's company and not having to listen to this. Now a word from your sponsor, right? So welcome to DocuSign. Thank you guys for coming. I hope you guys are enjoying the space. Hope you guys are hearing some cool talks. I wish I could join you for more of this, but I'm going to tell you about this hackathon that we're running this weekend. It's at Galvanize. Some of you guys are already familiar with this. We have $10,000 in cash prizes for folks who are familiar with hackathons and how we kind of do that thing. So if you're interested, it's completely free to sign up. Come learn some new technologies, meet some cool new people. Come check out what we're working on. Google and Salesforce are our sponsors. So it's kind of a big event at this point. My name's Aaron Liao. I lead our developer evangelism program here at DocuSign. I've been here about almost 2 years, so a month shy of 2 years. Before this, I was at Google, Microsoft. I was at 5 different startups. I helped bring 4 of them to acquisition. So this isn't my first rodeo, hence I know to keep it super short for you guys. DocuSign is, we're huge on our API, which is essentially why we built this team, which is essentially why they had me come and build out a program for us. 60% of all of our traffic, all of our successful transactions are actually driven through our API at this point. So we're huge believers in the API. We're huge believers in investing in companies that are using our APIs. We're huge investors in our community in terms of going out and spreading the good word at developer shows, with developer groups, with folks that are API practitioners, kind of like you guys are. We do what I call an ingredient API. So we build the e-signature API. You guys have probably interacted with DocuSign at some point in your past, whether it's you bought a house, opened a bank account, maybe you leased a car, maybe you signed an NDA or signed a job offer, right? We've all seen DocuSign in some way, shape, or form. I'm here specifically representing our API, which lets you do 99% of everything that you can see using DocuSign, except in a customized way, an integrated way for what you're doing. I think it's important for you guys to tell you guys that we're true believers in the whole API thing, right? We use our own API for our new DocuSign experience. So everything that you see that we're built on is built on the consumer-facing API. So we're huge on that. We put our money where our mouth is, so to speak. Everything that I told you about is on our developer website. It's developers.docusign.com. We have our annual conference, which is June 20th to 21st. Kind of an awkward time because it's deep summer for most people, but hey, they're paying me to plug it, so here I am, selling out for the corporate person. More importantly, our hackathon is this weekend. I've got really, really cool swag. I've got tons of money to give away. The food is from Buy Right. It's extremely expensive, I know, because it liquidated my budget for the year. So if you're interested in some free food, you want to meet some cool new people, want to come build some cool new stuff, come and check it out. And that's at like 3 minutes now. So thank you guys so much for coming. Thanks for your time. Enjoy your dinner.
All right, so the mic. Perfect. Can anyone hear me? Yes? No?
No.
Oh, yes. Hello? Yeah. Perfect. All right, thank you so much, Aaron. Thank you. Do grab some pizza. There's a lot. There's some on the side as well. All right, so any questions for Aaron before, while he has pizza? Yeah, any questions on you guys, Aaron? All right, everyone's good. All right, perfect.
The hackathon doesn't have a particular theme to go over. We're really proud of.
So for our next speaker, it's our local one and only from APIMatic, our product manager, Nauman. He's going to be talking about developer experience and talking about the launch we just made for our DX portal. Please give him a round of applause, and the stage is yours.
All right, hi guys. Can you hear me? Yeah, perfect. All right, so introductions first. I'm Nauman. I'm a developer who has swear and screamed going through Arinda's API docs for one, and the product manager at APIMatic. Thank you so much for coming, guys. We've come a long way. We're doing this for the first time, and really thank you for the support. So what I'm going to be talking about is automating API developer experience. I know it's a lot of buzzwords, 2 or 3 of them in the same title. So I'm going to try and make this short and useful. So there's that. Okay, so the first one's just context. We pretty much all know that. APIs are becoming big thing. You had 10,000 APIs in programmable web. Now there are 19,000. They're just growing in number. The internal APIs being used in organizations are uncountable. What I want to focus on in this slide is that APIs are not for savvy developers anymore. It's not a thing that tech companies are just doing. It's a thing everywhere. People consuming APIs are now developers of novice, of different backgrounds, and all kinds. So that is why the talk of developer experience has grown so much. You have great companies doing great work in developer experience. Companies like Twilio, Stripe, Box, all of their APIs are really well documented. The developer come in and enjoy the experience, and thus they're making a lot of money out of it. Right, so what is developer experience, right? So these are the 2 pictures that I put on for that. There's one developer who's happy, the other one's sad. And that's pretty much developer experience for me. If somebody's coming into your API, the kind of feeling that they have, the kind of satisfaction that they get, that is developer experience broadly for us. So, like the context being, there have been API developers now that just don't know REST APIs and they still want to consume an API. They're iOS developers, Android developers, and that is where developer experience becomes such an important thing. You really need to work on your API developer experience if you want all of them to come on, consume the API. So that is developer experience. So what is good DX? The first thing, getting started guides. So I'm going to list down the things that I think, or the company thinks, that make up good DX. Getting started guides, API key management, authentication walkthroughs, client libraries. So if you're talking to a developer, they don't know REST APIs, you need to be talking in their language. So you need to, if it's a .NET developer, you need to be talking in .NET. Then there are code samples, another thing that really adds to the developer experience. So you're giving them client libraries, you're giving them good code samples, then you're giving them the console where they can actually try out the API. Then you have FAQs, change logs, dashboard. So this primarily broadly makes up what a good developer experience looks like. Now, we'll look at the companies that are doing it well. Say Twilio, Stripe, Box, all of these companies, we have done a research here. They're giving SDKs, giving tutorials, giving code samples, and all of them have spent a lot of time and cost making these developer portals, right? They have huge teams that are working on these developer portals, but they're providing the exact same things: the documentation, the code samples, the tutorials, all of that. And these are the APIs that are making the most buzz. So to the next slide now. You have two kinds of developers that are interacting with APIs. There are API developers and there are API consumer. What they have to be doing is designing and developing APIs. That's what the API developer should be doing. What the API consumer should be doing is designing and developing applications based out of those APIs. What they end up doing, at least one of these, is either the developers spend too much time making those documentation, code samples, those libraries, the portal itself, or the consumer end up writing the client logic, writing those samples, all the stuff that should be provided by the API provider. So companies tend to make a choice between either one of these. What APIMatic and our vision is that you replace these, you let your developers focus on these things on the top, and this unicorn, this magical unicorn, comes in and handles these for you. So what is this unicorn? Automation. So you have your developers focusing on designing and developing the API. There's an API spec coming out here. It can be an open API or YAML, any one of those. You let automation do the job of code DX. So now you don't have your API developers working on, say, creating code samples. Neither do you have your consumers working on something that should already have been provided. And that is, what should it give you? It should give you happy developers, reduced time and cost, no maintenance, because all of this is being done automatically. Whenever you update your spec, your DX is done. It's high quality because it's being automatically generated again. You don't have to test it because there's going to be a human error. And then you have faster adoption for your APIs. So right, now coming to APIMatic, right? So the unicorn, there are a lot of unicorns out there. There are companies that are trying to do this, trying to automate the developer experience. What I'm going to talk about is APIMatic itself. We started as a company that created a code generator first. The code generator was then, that was the first step to the developer experience that we were trying to create, the automation of it. The code generator then became a documentation generator. We started generating documentation out of it, and then we thought, why not give it an interface? So that was when the developer portal came in. And now I'll walk you through what our roadmap looks like. Our eventual goal is the unicorn. So you have the unicorn that does it all. You just create the spec, maintain that, and your developer experience is done automatically and done right. So this is the vision, and this is where we have come. So I'll just show you the magic now, the power of the unicorn. You have external API specs. The unicorn comes in and creates this, right? This is the landing page for the portal. This is the documentation, all of it automatically created from a spec file. So this is if you're an external API or maybe a partner API, use a spec, create these beautiful developer portals, have all the code, all the developer experience bits that you need. I'll walk you through the demo too. But then another interesting thing that we saw was the use case of internal APIs. When APIMatic was actually created, there were not many people who were looking at the case where internal APIs are going to be helped with, say, a code generator or documentation generator. But then this customer of ours comes in around 2 years ago. They start using APIMatic internally. They have these 50, 60 microservices. They're communicating with each other. Whenever one of them is updated, they call our API, update the SDKs, they get the new documentation. And this is the case study that they gave us. So from a time to release of 1 week, they now have gotten down to 18 seconds. And the development cost, well, they've saved quite a lot out of it. But the big thing is the time to release thing, plus how you can actually really streamline the process inside your organizations too. And that is where it's so important, because internal APIs are now everywhere, in every organization, even though if you don't have external APIs. Then you have companies like Typeform or a company like ours that have those internal APIs, and those are the ones that are being used in the services too, right? So APIMatic's an API-driven company too, and this is what we use inside too, right? So we have 3 to 4 different projects. Whenever one of them is updated, we update the spec for it, the new clients are created, all of the projects are updated, automatically tested using the SDKs, and that has really streamlined our processes internally too. Okay, so now we'll get to the demo of the unicorn. So for that, let me just quickly. Okay, so this is the APIMatic landing page. What the first capability of APIMatic itself is the API transformer, and this is a lot of people tend to using it. it's a pretty simple tool. What it does is it converts between different description formats, right? So you have a list of formats that you can bring in, say a Swagger file, a YAML file, and you can take out a Postman, an open API spec, or a YAML. What this helps with is you can maintain a single description, say a Swagger file. You're using Postman internally, you're using all these tools different internally. You don't have to maintain all those specs. You just plug in the transformer using our API and get to using all those tools out there. So I'll just quickly grab a YAML file here so that I can show you the power. Okay, so here's a Swagger YAML file of one of our customers. You plug that into the transformer. You choose the format that you want to convert into. So say the Postman format, you click convert, does the conversion. So it's as simple as that. We have an API for this and pretty much everything that we're showing on the front end. So this is the transformer. The next bit that I want to show you is the documentation, the SDK, and the developer portal generation itself. So for that, we go to our dashboard. This is where all the APIs, you're maintaining an APIMatic, you can collaborate on them, have your team members maintain those specs. You can import or create an API. I put in the same URL here again. The first thing that APIMatic does is validates the description for you, right? So bring in any format, it validates it for you, tells you anything that you might be missing in the description itself. Once you're done doing that, you click edit and it takes you to our APIMatic editor. So you can either maintain description, say on a Swagger file or YAML file, or you can use this editor. So it's a UI version of maintaining a Swagger file or creating a Swagger file. What I'll do is I'll quickly walk you through these because these map to the documentation and the SDKs we create. And what we take pride in is we have spent 4 years creating this code generator, which has all the cases covered and all these features that make these SDKs and documentation not just mere wrapper, right? So there's server configuration, so you have multiple environments, multiple servers, all of them are handled. You have authentication, so auth 2, auth 1, any API, authentication that your API might have, the SDKs would have all the code plugged into them. So how to get the token, how to refresh the token, and the documentation for them would be automatically generated too. Then you have the code gen settings. So you have styling settings. So these are different settings that we have made to customize the SDKs and documentation, right? So you can put these in the Swagger file and have code generated that's according to your need, not just a code that's coming out of a generator. You can put in namespaces, put in project names, create some CI files, all those kinds of things. And you can put all of this in your Swagger or your YAML because you have extensions for that. Then another thing that we do and we use internally too is the test generation. So what we've done is we generate test cases with all the SDKs. And in our internal testing too, we have defined these test cases. Whenever a new release is done, all these SDKs are run with these new test cases that are automatically generated. Helps you test the SDK, helps you test the API itself, and really cuts down on the manual testing that we have to do. We just have to specify these test cases once, and they're done in all the languages. So really helps with that. These are some settings for that. Then we have errors, so exceptions, structures, enumerations, all of them are mapped into APIMatic. So this is pretty much it about the editor. Then you can create endpoints, create new types. Once you're done doing this, or you bring in a Swagger file, you can click generate, does the validation again, and so now from that Swagger file, you click proceed, and the portal that we just showed you is now made. It's a bare bones version of it. You can customize most of it, the CSS, you can have an embeddable version out of it. But the portal, after some customizations, we have an editor for it, would look like as something along. All right, so yeah, this is how after like 5 to 10 minutes of customizations, the portal looks like. This is the landing page. You have put in some custom sections. Your developer sees what the API does. Click get started and takes you to the documentation section of it. So a developer comes in, chooses what languages he wants to code in, so say .NET, gets the SDK for it. You can either give a zip file, a GitHub repository, GitHub link, or a published package, say you can do that automatically via APIMatic too, right? So you have the transformer plugged in. You can take a Postman or a Swagger out of it, and then for the SDK that you just downloaded, you have these getting started guides, all of them automatically generated on how to build this SDK, how to use this SDK, how to initialize the client. There's authorization, additional authorization information, like how do you store this token, all of that. All of that's done in the documentation. Then you can put in some custom docs, like markdown docs that will render for you. So this is just some sample markdown. Then when you go to the endpoint, so say the send SMS endpoint, you have the signature for it in .NET, the name, the description. The parameters, again, .NET for the SDK, response types, scopes, errors. And on the right, what you see are code samples, right? So to use this endpoint, you have these code samples. These are the trimmed down version. You click show complete file, does the imports, does the authentication for you. So the developer can come and just copy these and get started with the endpoint itself. But these are not a static code sample. You have the console, you can put in values in here, and they build the code samples in the language of your choice automatically. And you click try it out, it calls the API. So these are all the DX bits that we talked about. Most of them, we have a roadmap which covers the other bits. So you have the code samples, the SDKs, the documentation, all of that automatically done so that your developers can now focus on creating apps or actually creating APIs and not worry about this bit. So you can have an embeddable version or this hosted version that I just showed you. You put in the credentials right here, the client ID and the client secret. The SDK does the rest. So this is pretty much it for the portal. I'll go back to my slides because I know I have one more, and that's what I like. Okay, so the last bit here is the roadmap. So this one's really close to my heart because I'm the product manager. I'm trying to come up with new ideas. So I'd really like you guys to give some feedback on it. Okay, so we're trying to complete the portal for one. So what we're trying to add is automatic change logs. You already have descriptions. You can create change logs automatically for APIs. You have self-service API key management. So all these gateways, we automatically plug into them. Authentication, role-based content. You can create custom pages, have a dashboard that does all the analytics in an automatically generated portal. Then this is something I actually got the idea from Ken himself. So that we can actually create these descriptions for complete portals. So right now we just have a description for an API. What we want to go towards is a description for the whole developer experience itself. So you define it with one place and you get this complete developer experience, all of it automatically generated and all of it defined uniformly. So as a format for that. Then we're looking to add some sort of GraphQL support. The last one is where we actually want to create a marketplace where all these APIs are automatically documented. A developer comes in, says he wants to get 5 APIs and use those in his application. He chooses what endpoints he wants, and he gets an SDK and documentation personalized for him, because at the end of the day, it's automatically generated, right? So you can get in, because developers have this problem where they say it's bloated code, it's extra code, we don't want to use an SDK. Now it's just generated for you, all of it's mashed up, so you're not getting different dependency errors or all that. So yeah, this is what a roadmap looks like at some level. So yeah, this is pretty much it. Thank you so much. Any questions? Yeah.
Love the roadmap, love the variety. Actually, very fascinated by used to work with the roadmap from Uber. So really a bunch of different APIs. Of course. How do you deal with like user feedback? Because one thing that we stumbled upon, like probably 2 years into the journey of having all the documentation and all I realized it's kind of hard to understand what steps people don't understand, where they really stop, continuing to get the deal. Because there's some DX issues that you might not know. That's based on your description, how you communicate stuff, how you visualize that. Sometimes you just drop off because it's too complicated. You go to Stack Overflow or whatever. It's always easier to just Google some stuff and actually read through the documentation. So we have like an idea for a feedback mechanism for generated code.
Okay, so what we're doing at the portal level is we are adding forum support so developers can come and ask questions, and what we do provide is the APIMatic team answering them directly, right? So you have these SDKs, these documentation, and the APIMatic teams handle those questions for you. So we're adding forums. For now, the embeddable version can be embedded with a forum. So for now, there's not a version in the automated portal itself, but we're adding forums, and that's, I think, the way we are trying to go on feedback from developers themselves. Other than that, we have tried to make our SDKs, the documentation, so all the feedback that we get from customers, we're trying to improve on it every day. We've made them code compliant, made them follow the standards, so every language has the documentation, how every developer likes. So we've tried our best in that, but we're adding forums so that people can actually give feedback on the whole documentation itself.
Yeah, we had multiple issues where, like, our getting started guides probably didn't communicate efficiently, like the step by step, and people just get confused. So sometimes you need to like execute steps in a specific sequence in order to complete like the task you're trying to achieve. So like people just didn't know what to do.
People don't read stuff.
They don't know. Like they literally read the headline and it's like they drop off, go to Google, it's like, oh, And then come back at some point to actually dive, or not, we're just started. Thank you.
True. One thing that I messed it out in the roadmap, and I really wanted to specify was, so we want to also make these specifications for workflows. So you have these API endpoints, all of them are created, the code samples are created. Now, if you can specify those workflows, we can create documentation and helper functions for them too. So you want to go towards that, to test cases, code samples, all automatically generated for some specific workflows, some convenience methods that you want to create. So yeah, we're thinking about that too. Pretty much it. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Nauman, for the demo. And so I feel a lot of the people over here might know that this was recently launched, but people who are watching it online, so we recently launched our tool on Product Hunt. So this is the main thing that we want to cover as well, to ensure that everyone's aware of what we're working on and can pass their feedback along as well. So moving to our next speaker, Kin Lane, a visionary, a thought leader in the space. Our own CEO, our founder, is really highly inspired by Kin Lane himself. As a company, I think the first few people that I actually remember the names of, even though I didn't work in the same office or even in the same country, was Kin Lane. So I remember the first time I met Kin in Paris, I was like, Kin, you're the guy I know so much about. And Kin was like, yeah, okay, thank you. But an API evangelist, traveling the world, talking about what's happening in the space, everything new, everything old that needs to be changed. And really excited to have him on board. I'd like to introduce and pass the stage on to Kin now.
All right. Put that there. Is that loud enough? Am I gonna be good? Sweet. All right. So I'm going to give a variation of the talk that I'm going to give tomorrow at the Postman conference, but this one's dedicated mostly to APIMatic because, as I said, I've really worked with the APIMatic team since early days, trying to help them shape their roadmap and come up with ideas. But so I'm going to kind of emphasize. Do you have a pipeline for your API documentation? Real quick, who I am, what I do. So my name is Kin Lane. I'm the API Evangelist. I have a blog called APIEvangelist.com. I've been covering this space for the last 8 years. So I started API Evangelist in 2010. I've been early days, 2010 through 2015. I basically lived on the road, lived at hackathons, lived at meetups, conferences. I literally did not have a home and stayed in hotels. I drank too much beer and got too old, and I don't do that anymore. I don't work with as many startups anymore. I do work with Stream Data. Shout out to Stream Data, Streaming Data API. I do work with APIMatic team. I work with Postman. So I do work with startups, but I would say it's a lot fewer. I tend to work with enterprise organizations, federal government. I was in DC this morning, working with the Department of Veterans Affairs, helping them with their Lighthouse API platform. I work with like FDIC. I work with financial companies, banks, European companies. So you won't find me in San Francisco as much as I used to be. I think I come here maybe once a year, but I used to live here, so burnt out. You can find everything I talk about on my homepage and my website. I'm going to go through a handful of the stops along my API lifecycle, but my homepage is just a landing page. API Evangelist is 100 separate GitHub repositories, one for each of the stops along the API lifecycle, and it's 8 years worth of research. So I started in July of 2010, and I've been publishing there ever since. And if you follow it, you know I tend to publish a lot. So do you have a consistent API lifecycle for when it comes to delivering your microservices, your APIs? And so this is meant to be a lifecycle for one service, but it is meant to be consistent in a way that will help you scale your APIs. So do you use definitions? Is your lifecycle definition driven? Are you using Postman? Are you using OpenAPI? I'm on the OpenAPI initiative. I'm the only individual on the organization. I'm right there with Google and IBM. Also, shout out to Nico and APIs JSON. APIs JSON is our discovery format that we created. That is as they said for APIMatic, is meant to be about the whole API operations, API experience, where one component of it can be Postman or Open API that describes your API. So we created APIs JSON 2014, 15. So it was born out of work that I saw. I was in charge of going around the federal agencies for the White House, for the Obama administration, doing data inventory and API inventory in federal government. And we created what's called a data.json file. So if you go to any federal agency in the root, there's a data.json file that is a listing of all their data assets. We created APIs JSON, and that's meant to be the discovery format for APIs. And so every API or microservice lifecycle should begin, and every stop should be defined and governed by its definitions or its artifacts. As Nico pointed out, authentication management, every stop you're about to see is definition driven. I will also add every stop should also be measured and governed using its definition. Every stop should start with a repo, whether it's GitHub or Microsoft or GitLab or Bitbucket. Every microservice begins with an API and a README, and then I move into design. And when I mean design, I tend to mean RESTful design, resource-oriented design, but more often I'm using hypermedia formats, allowing people to negotiate hypermedia formats as well as basic JSON. I do a lot of work in government, so I allow people to negotiate CSV files from their APIs, which is not something you'll hear in Silicon Valley very much. But in Washington, DC, you do that a lot. I also am increasingly adding, augmenting RESTful APIs with GraphQL endpoints, allowing people to negotiate what they want when they want, but depending on the audience we're building for. API design could mean GraphQL. Having a versioning plan. There's no right way to version your API. I will not get religious about versioning your API. I don't care where you put your version, in the header, in your paths. The only wrong way to version your API is to not have a plan. So version your API, version your schema, version your code. Do you mock your APIs before you deploy them? Do you have sandboxes? Do you mock and iterate on your APIs before you work with any code, before you touch any code? Do you define, design, and then mock and iterate upon those APIs? It's a much more cost-effective way to do API development, but not all groups are doing it. Increasingly, I'm working with groups who are not just virtualizing and mocking their APIs. The Department of Veterans Affairs, the next set of APIs, all have synthetic veteran records. So there's 500 veterans in there that are lifelike, have personalities, have history, have lives, have healthcare problems, but they're not real. So it allows people to actually virtualize and work with APIs using synthetic data. It's using an open source tool called Cynthia that is all about creating synthetic records for healthcare. Now we move into deployment. So increasingly containerized deployment, but also I'm doing a lot of serverless API deployment using Lambda, using mostly Go, some Node.js, but being able to deploy very small modular APIs using open API definitions. That's part of a pipeline. But as I'm deploying APIs, I'm always very conscious of dependencies. So increasingly, I'm adding dependency definitions to my open API specifications that actually said, hey, this is actually just a proxy for another API. Hey, this is actually a facade for a SOAP API. Or hey, there's an IBM DB2 stored procedure behind this API. Increasingly, APIs are just intermediaries. And as Nico showed the BFF model, the backends for front ends, your APIs might just have APIs behind them. Your APIs might have other services, might have other databases, but increasingly it's going to be other APIs behind other APIs. And you're going to have backend for front ends. I also am increasingly documenting human dependencies. So other teams, I have my org charts defined in each microservice API definition, defining who is responsible for this as part of the core contact. But if it's dependent on another service or another API or another microservice, who do I need to talk to when I'm actually migrating, evolving, and versioning this API? All of my microservices these days are part of a pipeline, reproducible, continuously integrated and deployed, depending on the type of service that it is. I'm using primarily Jenkins, but depending on the group, it could be another set of tools. And then part of that pipeline, we're increasingly deploying portals, as APIMatic showed. Increasingly, most of the portals I'm deploying are static websites. So Jekyll on GitHub or any other flavor of static site on GitLab. You can do them in Bitbucket. I'm doing a lot of Bitbucket on premise in government because you can't run always in GitHub or in a cloud service. So all the portals are just part of the pipeline, and I'm defining it using APIs JSON as APIMatic's working towards. And I'm deploying that developer experience around that portal, which includes the documentation, interactive documentation, whether it's Swagger UI, whether it's Redoc. There's almost 10 separate open API driven documentation tools out there now. So pick your poison, integrate it into your pipeline, and make sure you're deploying your docs right alongside everything else. Make sure you're collaborating with teams, making sure you're taking those mock APIs and those API definitions, you're sharing and you're collaborating, and you're using those portals as central hubs for how people should be working together and collaborating internally with partners and externally. Have a plan for authentication. Use the common patterns. Nico touched on this a little bit. I'm still seeing a lot of basic auth and a lot of basic keys if it's really simple APIs. But if it's more complex and PII, PHI, healthcare or personally identifiable, use OAuth. And if you're, I'd like to learn more about the microservices implementation. You should work on that blog post because that's I think JWT at the microservices level as far as a unified auth strategy. I think that makes a lot of sense. Have a management layer. The API management tool is something I've studied since early days, whether it's the old guard, 3Scale, or now Red Hat, Apogee, or now Google, Mashery, or now Tibco, or whether it's the new guard, Tyke, Kong, or the stuff that's baked into the cloud, AWS Gateway, or with Google or Azure. Have a management layer. Log everything. Make sure you're logging all of your entire service stack for that microservice. I ship my DNS, my management layer, my web server, my database layer all to a single data lake. I index it with Elasticsearch, and I launch a log API on top of all my logs. So I can make sure that my logs for my services are first-class citizens. Have a monetization strategy. I'm not talking about making money, I'm talking about preparing to make money. What do your services cost you? What's the cost of your compute? What's the cost of your database? What's your cost of your DNS? If you run on Azure, on Google, or Amazon, you should know this. You should know this for every service in a granular way. You should know what all this costs in a granular as well as an aggregate and cumulative across all of your services. All of that should translate into your plans. You should have a plan that you put all your services into, whether they're internal, whether they're partner, or whether they're public. Bill, measure, rate limit, and bill against all of those plans, even if it's internal. Send invoices to other teams. How do you think Amazon got so smart with what they're doing? It's because they were measuring this and measuring the value exchange at the API level across teams. And so if we start measuring this and actually invoicing teams, people are going to understand the value of their resources and their data and what's being exchanged across groups. Monitor everything. Monitor it internally, monitor it externally. Test it at the granular level, have assertions, add that to your definition stack. Use Chai or any of the other assertion libraries that lets you get very granular at how you're testing your APIs. Don't just make sure they're up, make sure they're responding and returning exactly what they should be returning. Measure performance, measure it from different regions. Make sure you know where your clients are that are using your APIs and measure from where they're consuming and understand what your API's performance are in those regions. Take your open API definitions, load it into OWASP, ZAP, scan the surface area of your API. If you don't want to use an open source tool like OWASP, use something like 42 Crunch. That will allow you to take your open API definition and scan the surface area of your API and apply appropriate policies. Auto-generate SDKs from your open APIs. Make sure you're not doing this hand coding and hand managing it. I can't articulate enough the quality of APIs or of SDKs coming out of APIMatic. I've seen them evolve. I've seen what comes out of Swagger CodeGen versus APIMatic, and they don't compete. Touching on a little bit of what you said, I use GitHub issues integrated into the docs. I allow people to give feedback via GitHub issue directly from the interface of the portals. I allow people to create GitHub issues from anywhere within the developer experience, and those generate GitHub issues, but then I can tag them, I can integrate them into the feedback loop and the roadmap. Communicate. Every API microservice should have a communication strategy. How are you getting the word out? How are you letting people know about what it's doing, how it's working? As I said, have those dependency connections. Communicate with the backend teams as well as the front-end clients. Have a roadmap. And as their roadmap shows, as the APIMatic roadmap shows, they have a roadmap on their roadmap, which is like, but have a roadmap and share it. Make sure everyone's aware of your roadmap and what's going to be coming down the road. Communicate about it regularly. And as Stripe does, make sure there's observability across all these things I just talked about. Actually share your testing and monitoring and performance. Have status dashboards. Communicate about how you test and how you monitor and let people know what you're doing. Have service level agreements for each service. What is expected of it? Is it meeting those benchmarks? Are you meeting your testing, your monitoring, and your performance? Actually measure every stop that I just talked about. Measure does it have definitions? Are you following design patterns? Does it have status codes? All the other healthy design patterns. Are you deploying appropriately? Are they all using containers? Are they all using serverless? Do you have docs? Is it registered in a portal? Make sure you measure everything in every stop and be able to govern it and have a ranking and score and report on that value that's being generated. And if it's no longer meeting the expectations, that service shouldn't exist. And then lastly, most importantly, don't forget about your people. Because I've seen many a good API design and deployment fail because of human beings within organizations. So don't forget about all the people and all the, on the back end, on the front end, as well as on your team. Get out to meetups, get out to events, talk to people and understand what's going on. And as someone pointed out in DC yesterday, I guess that's a ninja. So make sure you pay attention to your ninjas as you're doing all this. And that's it. That's all I got. Questions, concerns? Oh, I guess I got turned off, huh?
Thank you for the presentation. This was super dense. As you already said, like 10 years of research and experience put into visual.
Yeah, go to the, you think that's dense? Go to.
Quick question though, and that might be not particular to this presentation, but is the problem solved of identifying what kind of errors and APIs are doing in an automated, generated way? Basically, you can have your templates and everything, but as soon as you go to the business logic and at some point you have just different error statements that are being returned. We're dealing with this and it was a struggle because we actually need to go through the source code manually trying to figure out what kind of error messages could be returned for each endpoint based on what use cases are. Is that solved somehow?
I haven't seen it solved perfectly yet. I mean, really, most of the automations being done, the 100% like people are doing across are the CRUD APIs, the more data-oriented APIs that have, or they're done with their facades for other APIs. The backend APIs have API definitions, so they're able to automate an interface based upon that API. The more logic-oriented APIs, they get more into code. Where I'm seeing the most movement for it is with serverless. And so I've actually started seeing people auto-generate APIs from OpenAPI definitions and have. So one of the most interesting aspects of OpenAPI that I track on is the X- extension. So how are people extending OpenAPI? And so I spider GitHub every night. I have a job that runs looking for OpenAPIs, and then I parse out all the X dashes and I study them. Because if you look at like how APIMatic, they have a bunch of X open APIs. AWS API Gateway has a bunch of X. Like you can import an open API into AWS Gateway and export it, and then it's got all this extra X settings. And so I'm seeing people have X collections for serverless API deployment. So it'll import into AWS Gateway, and it'll have a Lambda mapping. And so it'll choose the logic for the back end of that endpoint or that path based upon a Go script or a series of Go scripts. And so that's one of the ways that I'm starting to see people automate that logic. And so they have a library of Go scripts wherever they store them on S3 or GitHub. And then the open API definition kind of guides which ones are used and how they're used. Beyond that, I'm not seeing too many other on the logic front, but yeah, here's my homepage of all the stops that I spared you. So if you actually look,
Wait, you go through all of this?
I did not, and I could. I got GDPR. I've got GraphQL. Got Rogue APIs. I've got it all. So you can. Yeah, there's about 100 of them there. So yeah, dense. But 8 years worth of research and trying to track on how people are doing APIs and just understand what's going on. And I mean, not everyone's going to be using all of this, but the ones, for me, the more stops along the life cycle a company has, the more mature. If you look at Capital One, they don't have all these stops because a lot of them are internal. But they're measuring, every stop and have a maturity score for all their APIs. And the more mature your API is, the more budget you get. Department of Veterans Affairs. So they, every microservice begins as a GitHub repo, literally like it's a README, and then companies bid on that API or that microservice. They develop it, and then they do all those steps. And then if they meet the governance and the scoring, they get paid double if they meet all of it. If they don't, they just get the base rate. And so if it's a well-designed, well-performing API, they get more money and they get more microservice contracts. So it's a program called micro procurement. So it's trying to change how government, rather than $250,000 or $2.5 million contracts, we're doing $10,000 contracts. And it's just one microservice that does one thing, but it has the back end, it has the testing, the monitoring, it has the Docker container, it has everything all self-contained, and it has the business layer built in there as well. So.
And they follow these things so they're on the page.
What's that?
It's like a lane score.
Yeah.
100% of the lane score to actually.
Yeah. Well, it's called KinRank is actually, but there is actually I should rename it Lane Score, but yeah, I actually have a rating system for how much. And I do it based on the API JSON. So for the portal, so it's like I'll spider Twilio's portal. And depending on how many URLs they have in the API's JSON, they get a point for each one. And some you get 2 or 3 points. And then, so depending on how many stops or how many things you service, you have a higher rank. And so, yeah, I do have a rating score.
Thank you for that, kid. All right. So I think any questions? Any other questions? Any thoughts? Takeaways? Hopefully, some. All right, guys. Thank you so much for taking the time out. Definitely grab some pizza. We still have a lot. Yesterday I was listening to a talk, and it talked about how most of the meetups that happen in the valley, there's cold pizza and hot beer. So, this time we made sure that the pizza was so late that it was warm, and the beer was constantly, in the fridge and out. So hopefully you guys get some cold beer. But thank you so much for coming, and, hopefully we stay in touch. Thank you.
I have a suggestion. How about you put the game on and we'll have some pizza here?